All right, hi everybody. My name is Christina Ng, and I am BevNET FBU's new editor. Thank you very much. The name of this breakout presentation is Deal Anatomy: How to Avoid Pain Upon Exit. And it's presented by Ms. Brette Simon, who was formerly a partner in the Santa Monica office of Brian Cave, and now serves as a mergers and acquisitions advisor at MetaBrand. Brette has been involved in numerous big-name transactions in the food industry and is really a veteran in her profession. So welcome, Brette.
Thanks, Christina. I see some familiar faces from the talk I gave last year in New York's BevNet, and that talk was all about how to prepare your company for a sale or a capital raise. So this is sort of the part two, or the next step. You've got your house in order, you've done everything that I talked about last year, and now you've got a deal on the table, which is great news. Now what? And again, having done this for 20 years as a corporate attorney and doing M&A and venture capital and private equity, I've seen a lot of things go wrong and sort of traps for the unwary. And my goal for you is, obviously you'll have counsel representing you. If people haven't been through this 1,000 times like those of us have, there's some gotchas that you can try to avoid. And so that's my goal in this talk. So how to avoid pain. What I'd like to start off talking a little bit before is before we even start with the letter of intent and due diligence and NDAs, let's talk about keeping key employees, because one of the worst things that can happen in the beginning stages of a deal is you lose a key employee, right? They hear about the deal, they get nervous, they leave, right? And the buyer in many cases is buying, the people, right? They're sort of the asset that could walk out the door. So one of the key things to think about on anticipation of a potential sale transaction is setting up something in place to maintain key employees, some sort of a retention agreement, right? So there's a couple ways you can do that. One, and the goal is to obviously align their interest with yours. If you sell for a nice price, they get a piece of that. They're motivated and incented to stick around and make sure that you sell for the maximum price, right? So there's a couple ways to do that. One is giving them actual equity, right? You can give options, you can give restricted stock. If it's an LLC, it's called a profits interest. There's a couple issues that come along with that though, right? And you need to think about this. So if you're giving them a piece of the pie, they now have some control. Now it's not gonna be majority, they're gonna have a minority interest. But if you go to sell 100% of the company and you own 98% and they own 2%, they've suddenly got a lot of power, right? And the buyer doesn't want to buy 98%. They want to buy 100%. So be thoughtful about, before you give even a small sliver to an employee, that you're thinking through those issues and that they now actually have some power, right? What if they leave the company, by way of example? So and my talk, by the way, is to just sort of make you think. There's lots of answers, there's lots of flavors, there's lots of ways to structure and negotiate all this, but I want to make you aware of the issues so you're forewarned is forearmed, right? So you have to think about control and sort of power, right? You also now have fiduciary duties to those minority shareholders that you've given a sliver of the company to, right? So now you have fiduciary obligations to them. And finally, you have to give them information, right? Now they're a shareholder of the company, they're entitled to receive information about the company. So a lot of companies I work with find some of this uncomfortable for them, right? They don't want to give actual equity, they don't want to give necessarily on the information, they're nervous about giving that small percentage. So another option is to give phantom stock. I don't know if some of you have heard of sort of phantom stock. It's basically akin to a sale bonus, right? It's all the economics of actual equity, but without any voting power, right? They don't actually own stock in the company, so there's no fiduciary duty, but they have the economic benefit if you sell. So it's phantom equity. It's basically a situation where they get phantom stock priced at today's valuation for your company. As the company grows and you sell, they get the value of that spread, right? So it's akin to a bonus upon a sale. Now, the negative is that it's ordinary income, not capital gain like an equity interest. But for an employee who wants something, that's still a nice thing to get, and you don't have the issues that I just mentioned before. So just to think about some of the things you have to think about there, you do need to value your company, and so getting an independent valuation is a good idea to set that baseline. What are we worth today? So the employee knows what the spread, where they're starting from and where they have to grow to. And the other thing to think about is as you sell, that is a liability, right? So who's going to pay for that? the buyer is going to expect you to pay for that. If, by way of example, there's a piece of that payment that is contingent on a deal, or you have to stick around for a year post-close, and the buyer would have to pick that up, they're going to hitch on purchase price, right? It's seller's obligation to do. They consider that your obligation. So just factor that into the economics as you're thinking about the sale price and what your obligations are. Okay. Did it skip? I think it skipped. Oh, no, we're here. Okay, great. The other thing that's important in structuring these types of awards is how do you define purchase price, right? As I mentioned, let's say you've agreed to give a point, 1%, to a key employee upon a sale. Okay, well, what is 1% of what? Is it enterprise value? Is it equity value? I would argue it should be equity value, right? Because that's what you're taking home at the end of the day. If the enterprise, and just very basically, enterprise value can pick up a component of assumption of debt. So let's say the purchase price or the enterprise value is $100 million, but you're only taking home in your pocket $40 million because they're assuming $60 million of debt. Well, the cash to you is really 40, right? So it should be 1% of that 40, not 1% of 100. You're not taking home 100. You're taking home 40. That's the residual or equity value, right? It's a key thing to think about because you don't want to be out of pocket for more than you're actually, they're going to get a disproportionate percentage of the purchase price. Otherwise, you're not even taking that much home because of an assumption of debt component, which is factored into enterprise value but doesn't go into your take-home cash. So that's an important distinguishing thing when you're thinking about these agreements. Make sure it's based on equity and not enterprise value. The other thing to think about is what you should exclude, right? Again, it should be net, not gross. If you have other payments to people that you have to make on a sale, other sale bonuses, you should net those out. If there's an earn-out or any other kind of contingent payment, for example, there's money set aside in escrow, you shouldn't be paying them their piece till you get your piece, right? So if there's a 2 or 3 year earn-out, as the earn-out comes out, they should get their piece. As the escrow money comes out, they should get their piece, right? They shouldn't get paid before you do, right? You're the owner. They should be derivative to you. Expenses, same thing. If you've got transaction costs, you've got a banker you've hired, you've got a lawyer you've hired, all of that should be netted out from what they get. Retained liabilities. And the other thing to think about is if you're getting stock, again, that's illiquid, or you're getting a note, and that's going to be paid over time. Again, as that gets paid, they get paid. So the key is to tie it on when cash comes in the door. Okay, very quickly, the last slide on this. You're going to, and we'll talk about this in subsequent slides, as a seller, you're going to have indemnification obligations. You're going to have to stand behind your reps and warranties and covenant that what you sold is what they got. Similarly, think about whether they should be on the hook for a piece of that as well. If you have to give money back, should they have to give a pro rata piece back of the bonus they're getting? And maybe rather than having to go chase that person down 2 years later, which is often when a claim will arise, hold it back, put it in escrow, right? So if you have to indemnify for a certain piece, they should pro rata be put into escrow as well. When your indemnification obligation ceases, they get their remaining piece, right? Just things to be thoughtful about, and I think a lot of people don't think about this, and then they get in trouble later. And the other thing to think about is that employee, do you have other contracts with them? If they have an existing employment agreement, are you overpaying them? Are they already getting a bonus? Is there severance already that's baked in if they're not continuing on? And the other thing that's really key to think about is, if an employee is smart, they'll say, so what if you terminate me the day before the sale, right? So you've got to think about the fact that for them to be properly incented, you have to think about those dynamics. And obviously if it's for cause, that's a different story than not for cause. Let's say that they get terminated and there's a sale in the company within X months after their termination. Is it fair for them to still get something? They worked all the way up to the eve of sale. They get terminated 6 months later, you sell, or 2 weeks later, you sell. So usually a smart employee, if they're good counsel on their side, will ask for a tail period, right? There's some tail concept that, hey, I worked for 3 years. You sold the company 2 weeks after I was terminated. Come on, right? So don't be cute and be thoughtful about the fact that it's fair for them to get something, unless, of course, they were embezzling. Okay, different story. And by the way, just 2 seconds on taxes. What I just described to you has a lot of tax nuances. I took out the slide about things like 409A and 280G, which are tax code provisions that you don't want to spend your time on. But trust me, if you don't structure those right, there can be very punishing tax consequences to that employee. So this is one of those where you don't just sort of whip something up. I get these one-pagers, and we agreed to give Bob 5% of the company, and they didn't structure it right. There's a 20% excise tax, you lose your compensation deduction, and it's taxed the day that that agreement was signed as opposed to when they get the bonus. Not good. So just a public service announcement for call your lawyer on that one. Okay. So we've retained our key employees, we've got everybody locked up, we're happy with the team we've got, we're going to move forward on a deal. So the first thing, of course, you want to make sure is that you've got an NDA or non-disclosure agreement in place, right? And again, I come into deals a lot of times where people sort of forgot about that. They've disclosed information, and the sort of the horse has left the barn at that point, right? So let me talk about these a little bit. In addition to the paper they're written on, there's a lot of symbolic value to them. Certain, obviously, buyers want to be trusted and have a reputation. Somebody gets a reputation for violating their confidentiality agreement, people aren't going to do business with them going forward. So there's a lot of symbolic and psychic value to them. There's reputation, there's accountability. So they're very important to have for those purposes. The next bullets, I want to hit a couple points, and again, people don't always think about with NDAs, and these are kind of some key points to remember that you've got, make sure you've got included. One is, make sure that whoever you're contracting with on the other side takes responsibility for third-party breaches. It's one thing for me to contract with Coca-Cola and say, Coke, you won't steal my information, you won't do anything inappropriate with it, but you're going to use lawyers, you're going to use, your advisors, you're going to share this with your lenders perhaps. I want you responsible for all of them because I can't control that group, and I'm not going to go pursue 50 other people that you were allowed to share the information with them because they're acting on your behalf, but I don't want to be the one responsible to have to pursue them. So you, Coke, take responsibility for third-party breaches when you were the one sharing the information with those groups, right? So it's key to have that in your NDA. Second is you're going to typically want to make sure, especially with a strategic, right? Less relevant with a financial buyer like a private equity group, but certainly for a strategic, but they don't solicit your employees, right? They're not on just a raiding mission that they're fishing around and they're looking to take your key people, right? So that's important. And there'll be fights about that, but just giving you the big picture. Avoid mutuality if you can. A lot of times I'll see mutual NDAs. The reality of it is they're diligencing you. Now, exception is if you're getting stock in them, and we'll talk about that, you need to diligence them as much as they diligence you because you're getting their stock. But in general, it should be a unilateral NDA. They are bound not to disclose and use your info. It shouldn't be a mutual one where suddenly you're taking on obligations, right? It's one-sided. And this is a key one. If you do an asset deal, and in the last section, the last talk, somebody asked, should I do an asset deal or stock deal? And I'll talk about that in a bit. But if it's an asset deal, and you sign an NDA with a buyer, make sure, you sign an NDA with lots of potential buyers, right? And then you have your winner, and you go down the aisle with that winner. All of the people that lost, you want to make sure that you can enforce the NDAs against them. You want to have in there that those contracts are assignable to whoever I sell to, right? If you don't have that in there, there could be an implication that they're not assignable and they're not transferable. So when the buyer bought those assets, it no longer has rights to enforce that NDA because it was entered into with the seller, right? It was seller and those third parties. I want to have the right as seller to assign it to whoever wins so that that winner can go against all the people who didn't win if they should breach the NDA. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And that's key. A lot of people forget to put that in. That is critical if you're doing, especially in an asset deal. Okay. So we've got our NDA in place. We're going to start to share information. Right? So the key in diligence is what to disclose and when, right? This is especially relevant with a strategic buyer who could be a competitor of yours, right? Or could have a product that they're launching that you don't know about that's very similar to yours, right? So as I say here, enough for the buyer to provide a meaningful offer to you, but not so much that they learn your secret sauce, right? So what I recommend is in these key categories, who are your key customers, your key suppliers, your trade secrets, right? Your margins. Stage the diligence, right? Don't give everything away the first week, right? Make sure that, we call it getting the buyer pregnant, right? Make sure they've invested time, they've invested money, they're sucked into this transaction, right? They're not going to walk away at this point because they've invested real time and dollars. So stage the diligence, give them the easy stuff first, corporate records, contracts. People don't get excited about that stuff, but the lawyers will be happy, right? You can busy the lawyers for a few weeks. And then as you get further along and you feel comfortable, you start sharing some of that more confidential information, right? And one of the things that most people do these days is what's called a virtual data room, or VDR. Nobody shows up anymore and puts you in a room with a box of documents and says go, right? Because you have no control over that. What if they take a contract? What if they take a picture of it, right? You have no ability to control that, and you don't know what they're doing. Did they spend 5 minutes on this contract and 2 hours on this one? The beauty of a VDR, you have complete insight and visibility into what they're doing. You can see who accessed it, how long did they look at that document, what did they focus on. You can restrict whether it's read-only, print, copy, right? A lot of control, and also a lot of insight into what they're looking at and what they care about. Now, having done this long enough, people play games and they go click on every document. They do lots of things to make it look like they're interested when they're in a process. But you can usually tell who's spending meaningful time in the virtual data room. So as I said, much more critical to focus on when it's strategic. But again, what I think people don't always think about is, let's say it's a financial buyer, which is a private equity firm. What if they have a portfolio company in a related space, right? So I call that a hybrid. It's private equity, it's financial, but they've got a portfolio company in your space, so it's really quasi-strategic, right? So be thoughtful about who's fishing around. When you're doing a process, if you've hired a banker, you're going to have multiple people looking in that virtual data room who will potentially put an offer in. You've got to be careful about what you're disclosing and when, right? And the other thing is antitrust concerns. If you are selling to someone who's truly your competitor, you've gotten that your lawyers will counsel you on this, but you just have to be thoughtful about what you're sharing, because you can't share information that be viewed as sort of colluding or would be anti-competitive. Okay, and as I mentioned, try not to have a mutual NDA. There's an exception to that. It's really not just diligence on you as the seller, it's diligence on that buyer if they're giving you stock, because you're now going to be an owner in their company, or they're paying you a note, right? You have to look at their solvency. Can they make good on that note payment? I did a deal recently in a food space where I said to my client, I don't really trust this buyer. They've shown some evidence of some behavior that's fishy. Unfortunately, they were the only buyer in town. My seller sold to them. I said, please get as much cash as possible at the close. I really don't want you having contingent payments. They agreed to do a piece of the purchase price in a 3-year note. 3 years roll around, they default, because they've fallen on hard times and they're playing games, and I had to write some nasty letters and get them paid, but that's not the outcome that anybody wants, right? So be thoughtful about your diligence on the buyer side. If there's anything post-close that you're going to be getting, if there's stock, if there's earnout, if there's notes, be thoughtful and make sure you do your homework on them. Okay, so now we've got to the letter of intent. What's happened now is you've done diligence with multiple groups. You're down to the final steps of negotiating what's called a letter of intent with a couple key parties. Now what do we do? Okay. I hear all the time, well, it's not binding. Who cares, right? It's not binding. And there are a few provisions that are binding. So first of all, some things are binding. What's binding? Expenses. They pay theirs, you pay yours. Confidentiality, which is always binding. But the key one is exclusivity, okay? So for a buyer, it's really an option to see if they want to do a deal with you. For you, they take you off the market, right? You've agreed to get married. You've just got engaged, right? Okay, because they've agreed that you've agreed not to continue shopping the company after that letter of intent is signed. So you've lost, there's a famous slide that I didn't include, but basically it shows leverage pre-LOI, leverage post-LOI. You've lost all your leverage once you sign that letter of intent because they've locked you up, okay? So now you're pregnant, right? So there's, which is what we call it. So first of all, and I'll get to sort of key things to include in an LOI, there is, even though it's non-binding, first of all, the key thing that's binding is exclusivity. You will hear throughout the course of a deal references back to that letter of intent. And even though it's not binding, by way of example, all the key terms that you'll try to get in there about price and indemnity and your employment agreement, it's all non-binding, but it takes on psychological value. You'll hear people throughout the course of a deal say, well, that wasn't in the LOI, or you didn't bring that up at the LOI stage. Okay, so you don't want to keep hearing that. You want everything that's important to you as a seller. As I said, leverage is here before you sign that. While they are doing their best to wine and dine and woo you and get you to sign that letter of intent, even though it's technically non-binding, it takes on a lot of optical and psychological value to have key agreements, key terms that are beneficial to you baked into that LOI. Because again, once you've signed it, it becomes all about what was or wasn't in the letter of intent. That will be a constant refrain throughout a deal. So I will get to some of those key provisions in a minute, but I wanted to raise that from a psychological and moral value. The other thing that's important, as I mentioned, is exclusivity. They've locked you up. What I try to make sure I get if I'm representing a seller is that exclusivity terminates if they change the price, right? They lock you up, and then they decide, oh, you know what, we're going to pay half of what we agreed. Well, we're done. I can now go shop my company to other people. The other thing is if milestones, you set certain milestones for due diligence being done, right? Certain things have to get done on a certain timetable or you're out. It pulls their feet to the fire because I've seen things drag, and then again, you're tired, you've spent time and money, they hit you on the price, and you say, you know what, I don't want to go through this again. It's been 2 months at this point, just fine, I don't care. That's what they're that's what they're hoping for, right? If you want to play the mind game, you hold their feet to the fire, 15 days this, 30 days that, 45 days out, or you're gone, okay? So try to get milestones in there, and then if they're not met, exclusivity blows up, or if they try to renegotiate the deal. Excuse me, I'm going to get a quick sip of water. Okay, so as I mentioned, before you've signed it is when you have all this leverage. So sellers want long letters of intent, buyers want short letters of intent, because buyer just wants it to say, we're thinking about buying you, here's a range of price, sign here, we'll lock you up for 90 days, right? You want to know what the price is and what my key terms are, right? Again, as I said, there's value to putting that in there, even if it's technically non-binding. So one thing to think about is the purchase price a fixed number, $30 million, or is it a formula? Is it 6 times EBITDA, right? Depends on your business, depends if you think your EBITDA is going to go up between the time you sign that and the time you close. If you think it's going to be a bad quarter and this is seasonally not your strong quarter, I'd go for a fixed price, right? So it's a two-way street. Again, I'm raising the issues, everything's different for each business, but be thoughtful about what works for your business and what would be the best for your company. Okay, structure. So in the last session, somebody asked asset versus stock. As a general principle, buyers want to buy assets, sellers want to sell stock. Why is that? First of all, from a tax perspective, a buyer gets the step up in basis if it's an asset deal, so that's beneficial to them. They also like to cherry pick, right? If it's an asset deal, I pick these assets, I ignore all these liabilities, I leave all those to the seller. I've got this perfect deal that I've cherry picked what I want and what I don't want, right? The seller gets stuck with all the retained liabilities. Okay. Sellers like to sell stock. A, you get capital gain. B, you've sold the whole company, right? You're not stuck with some liabilities that you never wanted in the first place. The seller has gotten rid of everything and unloaded the entire thing to the buyer. So that's a leverage game. But again, get that in the letter of intent. I've received LOIs that were signed, and I say to them, so are you selling stock or assets? Oh, I don't know. Okay, well, you've lost all leverage to have that conversation because you've already signed a letter of intent, right? Guess what the buyer's going to say is, I want an asset deal. And by the way, if you're a C Corp, that's a very expensive transaction to have because, as you may be aware, C Corps have double tax, right? You pay tax at the entity level, you pay tax at the shareholder level. I've seen those deals signed before I got onto the scene. It's a very ugly situation to have to tell your client that you're going to pay a really hefty tax bill because of that. So we talked about tax liabilities. The other thing to think about in an asset deal is third-party consents. If you're selling stock, you're selling the whole company. There's no contracts to assign to a third party, right? If I'm selling assets, those contracts have to be assigned to the new buyer, right? I'm transferring assets, I'm transferring contracts. If the contract has an anti-assignment clause, now I've got to go get third-party consent. Maybe I don't want that person to know about my deal till we're done and we've announced it publicly, so you have confidentiality issues, right? You give that person a lot of leverage. I've seen landlords extract a lot of value on the eve of a close, right? Because they know they're the only thing holding up you and the deal getting done. So why don't I just jack the rent up if you want my consent, right? So be thoughtful about structure and look at your contracts ahead of time. If you know that you've got a sticky contract with, maybe you have an under-market lease and that landlord's going to extract their pound of flesh to get that consent done, maybe do a stock deal, right? You could think about mergers, and mergers is a whole nother bucket. But broadly defined, I want you looking at your contracts before you enter into a deal and thinking about that issue, right? This is to alert you to that issue. Okay. So we said, as I said, leverage, use it while you have it. Some other things to get into that LOI. In almost every deal, there'll be something that's called a working capital adjustment. Basically, the buyer wants to make sure when they buy your company, they're not walking into something that has no cash to run the business, right? So they want to make sure there's a certain level of working capital there that's consistent with what you've seasonally and historically used to run the business, right? So there's a target. You've got to leave $2 million in the company, right? Now, it's not just cash. That can be AR. It can be other current assets, right? So there'll be a target. Ideally, I'd like you to get that number in the letter of intent as opposed to waiting until you negotiate the definitive, because at that point, again, you've lost your leverage and suddenly the buyer thinks you need a lot more working capital than you thought you did, right? Two-way street, that adjustment can work both ways, right? So the target, if you exceed it, you get the extra money. If you don't meet it and you're deficient, they're going to come back after you for the deficit, right? So that's one thing to get into the LOI. Employment agreement terms is another. If you're going to be working for them post-close, get in there, what's your package going to be, right? Your compensation, key terms, what's the term, bonus, et cetera. You're not going to negotiate the whole agreement in advance, but get the guts of it in there if you can, because that's important to you as the key employee in the business. Escrow, indemnity, and earnout. I'll talk about what's typical for those in terms of percentages, but just know for now, try to get again, what is the escrow going to be? How long does it last? How much am I going to be on the hook for if there's a breach of a rep and warranty, my indemnity obligation? Earnout terms. Earnouts, which I have a couple slides on, the devil is in the details on earnouts. And again, please just don't enter into an LOI that says there'll be an earnout. There are so many facets to earnouts. You'll see the slide I have on that. Try to, if you're going to do an earnout, which there's pros and cons to that. If you've agreed to one, try to get the terms in the LOI ahead of time, because again, that's when you have the leverage. Okay. A couple other things to think about on the LOI. Ideally, you want a deal where there's almost no conditions to closing, right? You can sign it, you're done. They don't have to go out and get financing. They don't have to get approval from a regulatory agency, from a board, et cetera, right? If there are going to be approvals or conditions to close, again, I want to know what those are up front. If you hire a banker, you'll hear all that the banker cares about and talks about at the end of the day is certainty of close, right? Because they want to get their success fee at the end, obviously, and they want you to close the deal. So certainty of close is key. If they rattle off, I got to get approval from our European affiliate, and there's a regulatory this and that, and I got to go get financing, they may have a higher price, but it's not a real offer, right? Because how likely is it that they're going to get that deal done and close? I might say to my client, I'd take the offer that's a little bit lower, but has no contingencies, right? They can pay cash, they're done, sign and close, and we're done, right? So if there are approvals and conditions to closing, I want to know what those are before I sign a letter of intent with you. Financing, are you going to need financing? If it's Coca-Cola, they probably don't need to go get financing, right? If it's a smaller buyer, if it's a private equity firm that has to go secure debt, what if they can't get that financing? Are they just going to pay it all themselves and refinance it later? I had one client representing the PE side that did that. They just paid all equity. They usually, LBO means leverage buyout. They usually use leverage. They couldn't get the debt. They just said, we'll do the equity for now, pay it all in equity, and we'll refinance later. Okay, well, they got that deal because they were willing to step up and put all equity up, at least in the short term. Okay, this is something that I think a lot of people don't think about. Who are you signing that letter of intent with? This is especially relevant with a private equity buyer. A lot of times they'll set up a shell entity. They'll form a new co, a hold co, right? So, seller agrees to this letter of intent with ABC Co. Well, who is that? Did they just form a shell that has no assets and no cash in it and nothing to stand behind? What if the deal falls out and the LOI is violated, right? There's no one to go against, right? Because it's a shell. So you want to know, again, as I said, LOIs just lock you up, right? Well, if all they're doing is locking you up with a shell entity, they've expended no effort, they've expended no money, there's nothing standing behind that obligation. It's, as my colleague used to say, it's called a water sandwich. There's nothing there. So what you can take that one home, okay. What you want to have is someone with an entity that has real assets behind it, right? So show that they're serious. So if it's a shell, and they just formed the entity last week, which you can go online and see, make sure you've got either a guarantee, right, that another entity that's real, that has assets, that has money, is guaranteeing the obligations of that shell under the LOI, which explodes. It goes away once the deal is done, right? This is just a short-term guarantee. Or there's a letter of credit, right? There's something standing behind that commitment, and they're not just running around entering into LOIs with people with no teeth behind it because it's just a shell, right? And again, people often don't think about it, and they don't look behind that entity, and they think it's a real entity because it's affiliated with the fund, but they just formed it a week ago and they're not trying to be mischievous about it. That will eventually be the acquisition entity, but the reality is there's nothing in it right now, right? Okay. A lot of sellers will say to me, what if, they walk away? What do I do? Should I get a deposit? Should I get a breakup fee? Okay. Breakup fees are more common in public deals versus private deals. That said, you've expended time and money, they change their mind, they walk away. Should you have them put some money down to sort of, make it worth their while, make it worth your while? Put a deposit down. The challenge with these, and I've negotiated them, and sometimes you can get them, you spend so much time negotiating the ins and outs of these that, you could have just done the deal in the meantime, because you have to get into, well, why did we walk away? What if you didn't disclose something in diligence? What if your numbers slipped? What's the reason that we walked away as the buyer, right? You get so much into the weeds as to when I would actually, as a seller, be able to take that deposit or take that breakup fee. It's almost not worth the time and effort. So people ask me about it, I like to raise it. You can weave it in, and maybe there's some way to get some reimbursement of expenses back. It's very unlikely to get a true breakup fee in a private deal, though. So just something to be thoughtful about. Maybe use it and you trade it for something else. But they're tough to negotiate because there's so many nuances that you can't anticipate as to why someone walks away. Okay. Purchase price. As I say here, cash at close is great. However, there's a couple things that come in. So as I mentioned before, a buyer comes in and wants to know there's a certain level of working capital in the business day one, that they're not buying a business that they don't have the money to run, right? So typically there's that adjustment, right? Let's say the target, as I said, is $2 million. Let's say you left $3 million in. Great, you get an extra $1 million. Let's say you left $1 million in. They're gonna come after you for that extra $1 million. So again, it's typically, I have here one-way versus two-way. It's typically two-way. It's usually a two-way street. And if they're only trying to go after you for deficit, then make sure it's two-way, and you also get the excess if you leave too much money in the business, right? Okay, a couple of things to think about that, again, people don't always focus on. Who's going to prepare the final statement? The way this works is 60 days after the close, they'll do a final accounting of the company and figure out, what did you leave in the business? You told us at close you were leaving 2. What did you really leave, right? So who's going to do that analysis? Who's going to prepare that final balance sheet and figure out what you left? Is it you? Is it them? Now, I like to have the seller do it because they're controlling it, although they'll have approval rights, obviously. But that depends on what's your post-closing situation. Do you have an accounting team at that point? Have you left for the Bahamas? Are you working for them at this point? Right? So do you have the wherewithal and the people and the staff and the time to do that? Or does it make more sense for the buyer to prepare that statement? Because in many cases, they're a large company and have the ability to do that. Okay, so if you're going to let them do that, which again has its own pros and cons, make sure you agree on a set of procedures. I typically attach a schedule to the purchase agreement that says, here's the way this is going to work, right? These are the procedures. This is because GAAP is in the eye of the beholder. It's a set of approved, concepts in accounting. There's a lot of subjectivity to GAAP. Okay, so if it's going to be GAAP, what counts in GAAP? What doesn't count in GAAP? Well, we booked ours this way. We booked our inventory that way. The key on this, just like in earnouts, which we'll get to, is apples to apples. You told them you were going to leave $2 million in the business based on the way you did your books pre-close, right? This is how we kept our balance sheet. Well, the buyer may have a slightly different way that they run their business and run a balance sheet post-close. So apples to apples. If you do something unique or funky, or you treat inventory a certain way, put on that schedule that inventory has to be treated the same way, or you're going to have a discrepancy and you're going to get hit, right? So procedures is key. I mentioned GAAP. What if you don't do your books according to GAAP, right? That gets a little tougher to schedule because you have to schedule all the ways you're not GAAP, right? But I've done that, right? It's got to be consistent with your prior practices. They certainly can't run GAAP against your non-GAAP books. You're going to have a discrepancy, right? Your $2 million is not going to be $2 million on GAAP if you weren't GAAP. So again, apples to apples is the key theme on this. If it's not the way the buyer does it, schedule it, go through it, so everyone's on the same page about how it's going to be done post-close. And obviously, you want to make sure you have access to the books and records. If you've sold your business, you've given them all your books and records, but put in there an access, right, that you have the right to look at the books and records so you can audit what they did, right? Okay. So that's if you're getting cash at close. So sometimes, as I said in my deal where I advised my client not to take a note, they took a note. You'll sometimes hear that referred to as seller financing. You're financing the deal because they're just doing a note and you're sort of waiting to get paid, right? So you're financing the transaction. What's key to think about and remember is I think some people don't realize you're unsecured. So there's nothing to go against, right? If they don't pay you, there's usually no asset to go against. There's no house. There's no business. It's not secured. It's unsecured. Okay, so realize you are at the bottom. A, it's unsecured. And B, you're going to be subordinate. You're going to be below their bank line if they bring in debt to finance the deal, below the acquisition financing, below the senior and the mezz, everybody else. You're at the bottom of that totem pole, which is what my clients were in when this company fell in hard times. So just be aware of the fact that you're taking a seller note, unclear the likelihood of that getting paid if things get into, if the company gets into hard times, right? Again, pros, cons, you could try to get security. It's very unlikely. You're usually unsecured. Okay, so maybe you got some cash, maybe you got a note, maybe you got some equity. It's often called rollover equity, right? Because let's say you sell the business, you sell 70% for cash, you keep 10%, or sorry, he motioned at 10 minutes, so I was thinking 10%. You sell 70%. I can do the math. You sell 70. That's 30%. You screwed me up, Joe. You sell 70% for cash. You keep 30, right? You've rolled 30% of equity into the buyer, right? Key to understand, what are my rights, right? I now own equity in the buyer, in the new co, alongside a private equity. And by the way, that's common with private equity, less so with strategic. Usually strategics just buy you out, you've sold 100%. More common is private equity wants you to have skin in the game. They want you still incented to stick around, to run the company, to get that second bite at the apple and that big exit for them, the pop. Where are you in the capital structure? Are they preferred and you're common? Who gets paid before you do, right? If they're preferred, they're going to come out first. First of all, debt comes out before you. Preferred comes out before you. Does preferred just get their money back? Do they get 2x back? What's the structure, right? What's the liquidation waterfall? So understanding the capital structure is key, and what sort of approval and voting rights they have, because you've sold the business, okay? So you're junior. They can decide to sell at a time when you didn't think it was right to sell. They have approval rights to things that you're not used to having, right? And by the way, I got 5 minutes. Okay. I got approval of Christina. All right, let me talk about earnouts. A lot of people talk about earnouts. My philosophy on earnouts is do the deal if you're perfectly happy with the cash you're getting at close, and if you never see a dollar more, because earnouts are rife with litigation and fights and disputes over interpretation. So do not do this deal if you're banking just on the earnout. Get as much as you can at close. If you're happy with that and you would never see a dollar more and you were fine, let's move forward. Otherwise, do not do this deal. That's my philosophy on earnouts. This is a whole, this alone could be the topic of a whole other session. But you'll see all this, right? What's it based on? Sales or EBITDA? In general, the higher up the income statement you are, the better off you are, right? The lower down you go, they can play with costs and expenses and overhead, and it makes it harder for you to control, right? So if they base it on sales, you're golden, right? I actually was on a plane once years ago, and I sat next to a guy, and he said, we're just finishing our earnout. I said, what's it based on? He said, it's based on revenue. So we don't give about what our cost is. We're just blowing it out to get as much revenue as we can, right? Well, the buyer, if they knew that, wouldn't be happy about that, because they were just spending like left and right to get their revenue number up, right? Normally, a buyer is going to be savvy to realize that. They're going to base it on EBITDA, so they're going to focus on cost. So with that, I'm going to jump down to operational control. Again, apples to apples. You ran your business lean and mean. They had a CFO. They had a travel budget. They had overhead. Okay, well, the earnout target that you thought you were hitting now has been loaded up with a bunch of costs. It's going to be really hard for you to hit it now, right? All that needs to be in the agreement that says they can't do all that. Apples to apples. You can't add personnel, you can't add overhead, you can't add travel budget, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that needs to be in the document so that they can't put you at a disadvantage to hit your target. A couple other things to think about. Is it a cliff or a sliding scale, right? Is it, you got to hit this number, you get 0? Or, you know what, I hit 90% of it, I should get 90% of my earnout. But I've seen deals where it's all or nothing. That's a pretty severe and draconian situation if you hit it, if you hit 99.9%, but you missed it by $1 and you get 0, right? Try to get a sliding scale. Another thing to think about is it cumulative. I missed it by 5% this year, but I overshot it next year by 10%, right? Do I get to sort of make it up because I overdid my sales in the following year even though I fell short? So is it cumulative or is it just on a year-by-year basis, right? A couple other things. Again, GAAP. It's got to be apples to apples. If you thought about your earnout and it wasn't in GAAP and they're in GAAP, you got to reconcile those. Okay, here's a key one. Termination of employment. If they put in the document that no more earnout, if they terminate you, that's usually viewed by the IRS as compensation, right? It looks more like employment, right? You're not here anymore, we don't pay you anymore. Guess what? Your capital gains just turn to ordinary income, right? So be very careful in an earnout if they're trying to tie it to whether you're still with the company. That's going to be viewed by the IRS as comp, and it's going to be ordinary income. Okay, so where are we? Okay, I'm going to skip. I'm going to talk super quickly about escrow. Very quickly, escrows are done to hold back a piece of the purchase price to satisfy indemnity claims. Typically, I just want to give you some rough numbers so you go away with some market intel. It's usually about 10%. This is totally rough justice, but just ballpark. If you've had audited financials, you can usually have a 12-month escrow. If you haven't had an audit, they're going to want a longer escrow period to make sure that they find where all the bodies are buried, 15 to 18 months, okay? So that's just really quick on escrow. Okay, this is my favorite slide, indemnity, or don't move to the Bahamas yet, right? Because you've gotten your purchase price, but they can come back at you if there's breaches of your claims. Okay, so this is super quickly, but basically, you have a duty to indemnify them. You have a duty to defend any lawsuits that hit. These are key reps that usually will have a longer survival period. Again, broad strokes, normal reps, 12 months if you've been audited, 15 to 18 if you haven't been audited, max 24 months. These guys, this will last forever. You should always be able to say you own the business. If they figure out 10 years from now you didn't own it and someone's coming back and saying, I owned it, you're always going to be on the hook for that. These guys are usually statute of limitations, which is 4 to 7 years. Okay. I'm going to skip, this is more market intel. Caps is how much you're on the hook for. Broad strokes, 10 to 40%. Ideally 10 to 20% in terms of what's the maximum you have to give back a purchase price. Basket is a deductible that the buyer has to eat before they can come after you. 0.5% to 1.5% of purchase price is ballpark. I'm going to skip some of this stuff. Okay, I'm going to skip insurance, conditions of close. As I said, certainty of close is key. So if any of these are out there, less certainty of close. I usually try to sign and close at the same time, right? There's no sign and then a close. We sign, we close, you pay, you're done. If there's regulatory, you can't control that. You try to avoid diligence. Sometimes they want to make key customer calls, and you don't want to do that until you've signed an agreement with them. So try to minimize that, but if there's key customer calls, all I can say is there better not be any surprises. You better make sure those customer calls are stellar, right? Or they're going to walk away. Okay, I'm going to skip employment agreements and non-comp. Okay, I'm going to go to the last slide. The things I want to leave you with, cash is king, notes, stock, earnouts, all rife with litigation challenges, harder to deal with, especially if things go south in a deal, right? You don't hit your earnout, the stock's not worth anything, so cash is king. Leverage partners matter. If they're bringing debt into a deal, especially a private equity buyer, and things don't go well, who's that leverage partner? Are they what's called a loan to own, that they're aggressive and they're just looking to really take you out and blow out the equity and own the business, right? So be thoughtful about who's going to be a lender in that deal, especially view of economics going forward. And the highest price is not always paramount. And I say that because, like I said, if you're moving forward, you have an employment deal with them, you have economics, how are they as a partner? How are they going to work with you when there's a sticky issue or things don't go well, right? So it may not be get the highest price. It may be do your homework and do your reference checks on your partner and make sure that this is a group that you're going to work with because you're going to be with them for 3 to 5 years. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Brett. So now we're going to open up to questions. I'm going to cut the line a little bit. I actually had a question of my own.
Sure. She gets one free
Among
one.
many, okay. You mentioned the term EBITDA.
Yes, I'm sorry.
In a couple of your slides, and I was wondering if you could just explain the term, how you calculate it,
Sure.
and I guess how this value is used in terms of closing.
Sure. I'm sorry. So for those of you who don't know, EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And people refer to that sometimes as cash flow, sometimes as net income. It's a lot of, in many times, if you're a bigger business, if you're a smaller business, you may not even have positive EBITDA yet. But as you become a larger company, it's how buyers value you. What's your EBITDA? We'll pay a multiple of EBITDA. So if you were in the last session, they talked about how 6 to 8 times EBITDA for businesses with positive EBITDA can be a metric. So it's used in terms of determination of price, earn out, working capital, other. Okay, go ahead.
Got it. All right. Anybody else?
So I had 2 questions, Brett. The first was, when do you bring the lawyer into the deal? Because a lot of us are sort of entertaining discussions all the time. When do we bring you in? And the second one was, you skipped over the slide that said strategic or
Yep.
financial. I'd like you to go back to that and talk about that.
Sure.
Thanks.
Sure. So for this self-serving question first, when do you hire me? Thank you for asking that, Alan. Not that he was a plant or anything. So I would say, and Brad Barnhart is sitting here in the background, I usually get called, well, if I'm day-to-day counsel for a company, I'm always getting the call of, hey, there's someone looking, they've given us these terms, what do you think, right? And so I'll look at the letter of intent that they've thrown out or the NDA. You don't want to, my basic rule is don't sign anything, right, without talking to someone. So that could be the non-disclosure agreement. Okay, did it have all the things I just talked about? It could be a letter of intent. It could actually be where I usually say don't go, signing things, is the engagement letter with an investment bank, right? If you haven't negotiated 100 of those like I have, those are real economic documents. My agreement is basically, here's my hourly rate, please sign here, right? Theirs is a 10-page document with a lot of economics in it, okay? Because the way they get paid is a much more complicated formula and process. I know the ins and outs of those, so I really encourage you before, if you decide to hire a banker, and I actually had slides in here about pros and cons of hiring a banker, but in deference to the bankers, I didn't go through the pros and cons. It's just pro. If you're going to hire one, then call the lawyer who's been through those and knows how to negotiate them. I've seen people sign stuff that I'm horrified by, frankly. It's just, they can be very one-sided. I'm not saying that everyone does that, but they can be. So basically don't sign something. On the second question on this item, thank you for raising it because it was the slide that I liked and wanted to talk about. This is a slide basically that I put together. If you're thinking strategic versus financial, this is sort of a slide of what's going to matter more to each of those, right? If it's a strategic buyer, it's all about synergies, right? They'll pay for synergies, right? Remember I mentioned that if it's a financial buyer that has a portfolio company, it's kind of quasi-strategic, right? Anytime they can do 2 + 2 = 4.5 or 5, they're going to pay for that, right? Debt. Again, as I said, Coca-Cola probably has enough cash on the balance sheet, doesn't have to go out and get a loan to buy you. Smaller company, private equity, they lever up the company. So you got to make sure that your company is leverable, right? Does it have EBITDA? Does it have assets to loan against? If you're already heavily levered, it's going to be hard for them to put more debt on that company, and they may not be able to buy you if they're a private equity firm that plays on the leverage multiple. Management team, much more important for financial. As we know, for better or for worse, if a strategic buys you, you may not always be sticking around post-close. At least certain members of the C-suite may not be. But if it's a financial buyer, the management team is critical. They're not looking to come in and run that company. They're looking, I'll wrap it up, Jeff. They're not looking to come in and run the company. They're looking to rely on you for the next 3 to 5 years. So if you're looking to go sit on the beach, right, and go to those Bahamas, you got to be thoughtful about the fact that a private equity firm is not going to want to hear that, right? So this is the talk I gave last year about if you do want that outcome, you better have a team beneath you that can run the company. If you want to cut out and you've got your money and you're done, you better have trained people beneath you to make yourself redundant, right? That's kind of the theme of that one, which is a different talk. Competitive information, again, much more of an issue with a strategic buyer. You giving your secret sauce away to your competitor, right? Less relevant if it's just a financial buyer with cash, again, unless they have a portco that plays in your space, then it's kind of a hybrid. Okay, customer concentration. So the example I gave in my talk last year, I had a food seller that had founderitis, right? There was no one beneath the company that could run it besides those two. They had not trained anybody beneath them. They had 80% with Costco and Trader Joe's in terms of customer concentration. 80% of their business is with Costco and Trader Joe's, right? And what was the third? And the founders wanted, so the founders wanted to leave. They had terrible customer concentration, and they'd entered into some bad contracts, right? So all in makes it very tough, right? Customer concentration, very big issue for financial buyers. If they're starting to see more than 20 to 25% with a customer, very hard to get debt, and it's going to spook them. Strategic, less so, right? So that food company that I referenced had one buyer at the end of the day, and who was it? Their arch enemy, who they hated, their competitor, and the company went from $8 million in EBITDA to a loss in about 1.5 years because they ran it poorly, then they defaulted on the note, et cetera, okay? Not the outcome I wanted to see for a very nice, successful company and some great founders, but they didn't train people below them. They had terrible customer concentration. So these are key things to think about as you grow your business. Who's going to be synergistic? Do I have a company we can put some debt on the books? Have I already over-levered it? Do I have a management team that's either going to carry on, or I've trained people below me if I want to go sit on that beach? Am I sharing competitive information with a key competitor? And what's my customer concentration? And none of these are things you can fix tomorrow, but again, be thoughtful as you grow your business. If that 80 could have dropped to 40, we would have been in a much better position. Okay.
All right, Brette actually told me that she was going to stay after a little bit for extra questions if you guys do have it. So.
And I wanted to make it clear also, I was saying, let's keep it rolling.
Oh, okay.
There's only a tabletop show after this, so Brett is glad to stay up there, take all your questions.
Hey, well, let's not go that far, Jeff. Somewhere in the middle of those two.
right.
No, I'm happy to keep chatting. There was a few other slides. I'll mention one other slide that I didn't get to talk about. Let me see, I think it is before this one. There, insurance. This was something else I wanted to raise. I sold another food deal last year to a very large strategic. Interestingly, has started to use reps and warranty insurance. Does anyone know what representation and warranty insurance is? Anyone? Okay. So the insurance brokers way back in the day would pitch us M&A lawyers on this stuff all the time, and we would just sort of ignore their calls. Now it's actually being used, especially by buyers. The idea is, rather than get into fights and go and pursue the seller for an indemnity claim, I just buy a rep and warranty policy. If there's a breach, I go after the policy. And what's nice about this, the reason that deal I did last year, the way they did it that way, is the buyer's position is the seller was coming to work for the company. The last thing I want to do is basically pursue a claim against my key employee. It doesn't make for good employee-employer relations, right? I'm just going to go pursue the policy and I get paid. So the way it was structured is their retention or their deductible was equal to the seller's cap. So if the seller's at most on the hook for $1 million, that happens to equal the deductible that the buyer would have to pay out of pocket, right? So once that $1 million is hit, it's all on the insurance, right? Because they've met their retention of the deductible, the seller's done paying, again, other than key reps like ownership or fraud, right? If you commit fraud, all bets are off. But it's something to think about because people are starting to use it more, and it's an interesting way to sort of bridge a gap. It's an interesting way to not have animosity sort of post-close. You just go after a policy. So that's one piece. This one is the one I want to make sure you guys think about. Sellers sign these agreements. They agree to indemnify the buyer post-close. Do you have insurance for these claims, right? Okay, there are two types of insurance policies. There's claims made and there's occurrence. If you have an occurrence-based policy, I mean, this is broad strokes, talk to your broker, but in large measure, you're okay because basically you have a policy that says when that incident, which is going to be a pre-closing incident, right? You're only repping to things that happened on your watch. When it occurred, you had coverage, right? You had insurance coverage for your company through the close. You've got coverage. If it's claims made, you only have coverage when the claim is made. The claim is going to be made post-close. Guess what? You don't have insurance post-close. You've stopped paying for insurance because you sold the company, right? So I say that to sellers to say, get a tail, right? If you have claims made, get a tail because you will have no insurance coverage for that claim otherwise, right? Again, occurrence, you probably do. Claims made, you most likely do not. So don't be caught naked without insurance if there's going to be a post-closing claim. So that was one other thing I wanted to mention. The other stuff was basically employment agreements and non-compete, which are sort of topics of another lecture anyway. Oh, and do your estate planning. I get clients all the time that come in and they haven't planned. You can't plan on the eve of a deal. It's too late. So if you're thinking about a sale in the next couple of years, talk to your trust and estate lawyer. Do whatever moving around you're going to do, setting up trusts, putting things in, wherever they need to go. You cannot do that in an effective way right before the sale. You're not going to be able to do effective estate planning. So I bring that up to do in advance. Okay, I think I'm really done now.
All right, great, thanks, Brett.